Hello, everyone. It's Larry Kotlikoff back with Economics Matters, the podcast. I'm delighted today to have Wade Pfau. He's a major player in the financial retirement space or the retirement advisory space. He's a PhD in economics from Princeton University, so that's close to my heart because I'm a PhD too. We're both economists, and but Wade has been unlike myself, and I've worked on kind of financial planning from the angle of developing software. Wade has worked on it more from the inside of the industry, advising the industry on kind of economics-based perspective to the questions that the manner in which they're addressing retirement, saving, insurance questions, reverse mortgages. He's written, well, let me just kind of take you through his bio, and then we're going to have Wade give you his earlier bio before he becomes a professional. And then we're going to talk about it to start with a really interesting paper called The Dangers of Monte Carlo Simulations, which I think is somewhat devastating to traditional financial planning, but I'm biased and I can't claim not to be. But anyway, Wade has a lot of initials after his name. He's, first of all, a PhD in economics from Princeton University. He's also a CFA and an RICP. He's the founder of Retirement Researcher, an educational resource for individuals and financial advisors on topics related to retirement income planning. So that's Retirement Researcher, and you can check that out. He's a co-founder of Retirement. He's got a lot of things he's got going on. Co-founder of the Retirement Income Style Awareness Tool. Maybe you'll tell us a bit about that and how people can access it. And a co-host of Retire with Style, a podcast. And we also want to link to that when we post this. He also serves as a principal and director of retirement research for McLean Asset Management, and he serves as research fellow with the Alliance for Lifetime Income and Retirement and the Retirement Income Institute. He's a professor of practice at the American College of Financial Services, past director of the Retirement Income Certified Professional RICP designation program. So that's a relatively new designation program that he I guess, initiated. And now he holds a doctorate, as I said, in economics from Princeton. He's published more than 60 research articles in a wide variety of academic and practitioner journals. His research has been discussed in The Economist, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Time, Kiplinger's, and Money Magazine. He is a major player. Everybody in personal finance anyone knows Wade Pfau's name. He's received lots of awards. I could go on for quite a bit. Investment News Power Award, the Investment Advisor 35 list, Financial Planning Magazine's Influencer Award, two-time winner of the Journal of Financial Planning Management, Journal of Financial Planning Montgomery Warscher Editors Award, a two-time winner of the Academic Thought Leadership Award. I mean, the list just keeps going on. If you just Google Wade Pfau, Phau, and find his bio, you will learn all these things, but also that he contributes to Forbes, Advisor's Perspective. He's a panelist an expert panelist for the Wall Street Journal, and he speaks to lots of different national conventions, organizations, CFA Institute, CFP Board, the FPA, the NAPFA, Academy of Financial Services. And then there's 4 books that you can find covering very interesting topics in personal finance. And he'll tell us about everything that he wants to within the hour. But I wanted to start off by, Wade, having you tell us about your early life, where you grew up, how you found your path to economics, and then how you found your path from economics to focusing on retirement income and spending and security and everything in personal finance. Go for it.
Sure. And thank you for having me on there. I've always looked up to you and read many of your articles and books before meeting you in person about 10 years ago at this point at one of the Retirement Income Industry Association
Yeah, yeah.
events in Boston. I think maybe not the first time, but at Salem State University, we had a chance to talk, I remember. So it's great to be on the show. And yeah, I grew up in Michigan, moved to Iowa in high school, really uh, thought thinking along the lines of becoming a scientist, but then when I discovered economics late in high school, I think it was for the academic decathlon events, and then doing a self-study for the AP economics exams, really fell in love with economics, went to the University of Iowa, majored in economics there. I did a lot of work with John Solow, who is the son of the Nobel laureate, Robert Solow, who I imagine you probably know being in Boston.
Yeah,
Deirdre
yeah.
McCloskey as well. They encouraged me to apply for graduate school, went to Princeton, and I love economics at the undergraduate level. As you know, it's one of the fields where at the graduate level, it's very different than what undergraduates learn. And so I made it through the graduate program, earned my PhD, but wasn't the kind of superstar in graduate economics in terms of going on to a top university from there. But went to Japan and taught economics at a university in Japan for 10 years. I did an internship in grad school at the Social Security Administration. And that's what really got me started down the path of what ultimately making the transition into financial planning and personal finance. We were looking at the stochastic model for the trust fund. That was a really big activity going on at the time at the Social Security Administration. And so that helped me build the skill set that ultimately really helped to build my career around it. My dissertation was on President George W. Bush's proposal to create the personal retirement accounts and
Uh-huh.
modeling that, looking at how
Yeah.
that might perform. And then when I was in Japan, the university was mainly for government officials from developing and emerging market countries. So I did a lot with pension systems in different countries, but as a part of wanting to return to the United States, looking for something more marketable, kind of getting into the area of retirement planning. It was with the CFA program.
Did you, when you went to Japan, did you learn Japanese? And then why did you go to unusual thing to do?
My original career intention was to become a government economist, and I
Okay.
had some opportunities at the Treasury Department and so forth. But at the last minute, I thought it'd be nice to try being an academic and to try living in another country. And it'd be a lot easier to go from academics into government than vice versa. So then
Yeah.
I started looking at opportunities in other countries, and Japan became the best option available at the time. It was fairly late in well, not late in the job market process, but at least when going to the AEA meeting in January with the job interviews, at that time I was still more focused on the US market. And so then started applying to
So which
jobs
part of
overseas.
which university in Japan was it?
It's called the National Graduate Institute for,
Yeah.
am I saying it? Gosh, the GRIPS, so graduate, the name in Japanese is different from the name in English. And I'm now, it's, it's a public policy school. So it's
And were
not
you able to
connected
teach
to.
in English or did you have to teach in
Mhm.
Japan?
Yeah,
Yeah.
so the students were not from Japan. They were
Oh, I
from
see.
countries mainly in East and Southeast and South Asia and Africa. So yes, I was teaching in English. You asked about learning Japanese, and I didn't put as much effort into that as I should have. I was fine at restaurants and things, but not conversational in Japanese, and I didn't need it for the job. So it was
Oh, I
more.
see. So 10 years. So, and then you came back to what was the next, sorry, I interrupted you, but you were saying what happens after Japan?
Well, wanting to get back to the US, when I went to Japan, I got married and had two kids there and thought before my oldest started kindergarten, wanting to get back to the United States. And so that's when I was studying for the CFA designation as a part of trying to be marketable in the US. And that introduced me to retirement planning. And ironically, since it's not necessarily a focus, but I think that's where I first learned about the 4% rule idea that I know you have many issues with, but that's a starting point in the financial services world to think about what's a sustainable retirement spending strategy.
Right.
And that led me down the path of doing research in that area. The first paper I wrote was just looking at the 4% rule is based only on US historical data. And I tested it with international data and found it really is an anomaly of the US and Canada, but none of the other 18 countries I had access data to it didn't work in those other countries. But it's just I received a good people are reading that article, which the economics research I was doing was mainly just ending up at university bookshelf or the shelves in the library. So I thought, wow, actually people are interested in this retirement planning research. And so made the full shift over, moved to the US, went to the American College of Financial Services, as a job title of professor of retirement income, which I think is still a unique job title. And so that became my focus.
Cool. So tell me, this original paper about the 4% rule, was that kind of focused on looking at the probability of making it to, was there criteria here if you're not running out of money? Was that like the 80% probability threshold? Was that kind of the focus? And that you're saying that with other data from other markets, you wouldn't have the same probability?
Well, I mean, so with the US data, that's kind of Bill Bengen who developed the rule or that guideline, looked at the rolling historical data since 1926 over 30-year periods with 50 to 75% stocks. It was actually in the US data, 100% success rate. It wasn't even about like a 80% success rate, that you could have always historically taken out 4% of the initial retirement balance and sustain that amount of spending with inflation growth for the next 30 years. And so looking at it that way, it was the Dimson, Staunton, Marsh global returns data set that goes back to 1900. That 4% rule worked with the US historical data, with Canadian historical data.
This is invested 50-50 or?
And 50, generally 50 to 75% stocks is the area where the 4% rule has the most success.
And so with 100% probability for any initial starting date, I guess one maybe nitpicking here for me would be these aren't kind of independent samples because you're using the same
overlapping
data. So there's a question about whether you have more like 5 observations as opposed to 130, whatever, depending, because you're looking at like 30-year, 40-year holding periods. So I see, but it is kind of remarkable that 4%, even if you had your money in, let's say the day of the crash in 29, and you had, let's say, 75% stock, 25% bonds, you're saying that in real terms, one could be taking out 4% of the portfolio you had the day before the crash. Now, the crash brought down the stock market, at least in nominal terms, by 86% between 29 and 33 at the bottom. And then it took a long time to get back up to where it even was, nominally speaking. So, but you're saying that even that worked for...
there's a little bit of caveat on that one, because the inflation adjustment aspect with the deflation of the Great Depression, I think the price level went down about 25%. So that helped salvage the situation somewhat.
So the real actually decreasing. It was probably more like a 50% decline, I guess, rather than a 86% decline because of the decline in prices. Right. So that's,
and with 100% stocks, the 4% rule didn't survive the Great Depression, but bonds, the real value of bonds doubled in the Great Depression with the deflation as well. So that, yes, a diversified portfolio barely squeaked out with the 4% rule.
So, economics would say to kind of leave things on autopilot is not the right answer, because, the market, like, for example, in the dot-com bubble, we had the market drop 50%. In the Great Recession, we had a drop 53%. Now, of course, it came back in spades, but nobody knew for sure that would happen. So economics would really say you want to adjust every year in light of how well you've done, because otherwise you're putting yourself at, let's say, too high a sequence of return risk. Maybe that's might be the way to, well, yeah, you're compounding but you're saying that problem is not as severe. Now, what's your, just on the 4% rule, since we're talking about it, what's your perspective on it now? Do you feel like this is a good thing for people to be using in retirement? Our software doesn't, do that. It says, as you adjust, shows you how much to adjust every year in light of where you are. But the traditional, very small segment of the retired community is using our software. So almost everybody who's going to a financial planner is getting this 4% rule. What's your feeling about it these days?
Well, it doesn't have a lot of practical usage. I mean, and actually, really, the point of it, in terms of what came before it, it made an important contribution, because what the 4% rule was responding to was just this idea that, well, historically, the S&P 500 averages 7% after inflation. So let's plug that into a spreadsheet. 7% is safe because you just spend your portfolio gains every year and you can go on forever doing that. And the 4% rule at least pointed out that no, with market volatility, even if you average a 7% after inflation return, you don't get a fixed return every year. And if you get a downturn early on and that recovers later on, you're not going to get to spend at the same level as if you got that consistent fixed return every year. But beyond that, it's not useful for retirement because it's very difficult to spend a fixed inflation adjusted amount every year from your portfolio, since you have all these other cash flows. Like if you're delaying Social Security, you may be spending more early on, less later on. Taxes are not part of the 4% rule, and it's very difficult to have constant inflation adjusted taxes in retirement, which means your after-tax spending could be quite volatile, even though the 4% rule was just meant to set you up with constant spending over time. So it doesn't have a lot of practical use in reality. It's more just a research guideline to help give some idea about what might be a sustainable level of spending.
Okay, so you're not advocating this, rather your research has kind of more criticized it, I guess, on balance, and saying, well, it didn't really work in lots of other countries. If you invested in Japan, there was 30 years, I think there's a good 30-year period where the market was lower after 30 years than it was initially. So the idea that every 30, any 30-year period, any holding period, the market's going to be higher than it was, and therefore that stocks are safe in the long run. Again, there's the issue of reusing the same data, because we might only have like 4 or 5 independent 30-year periods,
right,
to look at that. And but anyway, tell people where would be the best place to see your compendium of work on this topic and other things. What we go to wadepfau.com, or where do we go to look at your?
Yeah, wadepfau.com can get you to a lot of that, and retirementresearcher.com is one of the main sites. But you mentioned that I wrote 4 books. That really, there was one main book I was trying to write all along, and that summarizes everything else, and that's the Retirement Planning Guidebook.
Okay.
That covers pretty much everything, at least at the overview level, anything that I've written on retirement planning.
So can you give us the elevator pitch on that? Just sell the book to everybody for a little bit. So it's Retirement Planner.
Retirement Planning Guidebook. And
Retirement Planning Guidebook, and it's at Amazon everywhere, and Indie and your local bookstore, presumably. I guess
online mostly, yeah, and definitely Amazon is the outlet that sells the vast majority of the copies of it. So that's probably the best place to look. But it's on Apple Books and everywhere else too. And it's
pocket, yeah.
Well, a comprehensive look at what I feel is all the important aspects of building a complete retirement plan, starting from just assessing what's your overall style to approaching retirement income, understanding retirement risks. Then I talk about retirement budgeting, and I talk about a simple funded ratio idea of, do you have enough assets to meet your liabilities in retirement as identified through your budgeting and if you have any legacy goals and so forth. And then just talking about the sustainable spending from investments, like the 4% rule is just the starting point of that, but you have variable spending strategies and everything that goes into that. Talking about how different types of annuities work, going through the whole process of how to build a Social Security claiming strategy, long-term care planning, housing and retirement, Medicare and health, well, health before Medicare and then Medicare planning, long-term care. The longest chapter is just on tax efficient retirement distributions and thinking about whether Roth conversions can help get more after-tax spending in retirement, estate planning, the non-financial aspects of retirement, everything, just having purpose and passion and making sure people have a replacement for work, or if work is going to be part of people's retirements, because work provides a lot besides just a salary, and people need to think about the time they spend during the day, the camaraderie and social engagement that work provides, the sense of purpose and everything else. And so you need a replacement for all that. And then just a chapter that puts it all together and provides step-by-step, here's how to really integrate all this into having a complete retirement plan.
So what year did the book come out?
The second edition is fully updated. It came out in March of this year, so it's fully updated. Okay. The initial version, the initial book came out in September 2021, but I fully updated it.
Okay, so this is really pretty recent. I apologize for, I should have read in advance of our session here, but being a little bit too busy, overbooked to get a chance, but I will take a look. So it sounds like super practical advice. How do you see, we're going to talk about this really cool paper you just did, but just, as an economist, and you're now in this sea of non-economists, right? And the traditional CFP program, the traditional there's lots of designations, lots of different programs that are not being offered by economists. They don't seem to have much economics content. They're not going back to Irving Fisher's life cycle consumption model, as far as I know, because I've never gone through a CFP program or a CFA program or RIA, just any of these things. So I don't know. So I'm really asking, is there much economics content? And if not, does that trouble you? Has your goal been partly to inject statistical analysis? Obviously that's got economic content, but in general, do you find yourself, it seems like the financial industry loves you, from what I can tell. Everybody talks about Wade Pfau. Maybe it's just your winning personality, but but do you find yourself at ease with the non-economists in this industry?
Yeah, I mean, right. There's in the CFP program for the certified financial planners, there's really no mention of life cycle finance. And I know that's like a big concern you have with the 4% rule, is just people are supposed to consumption smooth. And so it's going to be pretty random whether or not applying the 4% rule to your savings is going to smooth your consumption over your lifetime. I try to bring in some economic principles into what I do in terms of just the intuition of utility, which is missing entirely from most of the financial planning framework. And you can't really discuss utility directly with the financial planning world, because it's just people's eyes are going to glaze over about maximizing utility subject to a budget constraint. But at least the idea of diminishing marginal utility, you can bring that concept into the conversation and people can understand, especially on the investing side. If someone's thinking about taking on more risk than they need, well, if your wealth doubles, how much happier would you be? Versus if your wealth dropped in half, how much worse off would you feel? And in many cases, probably they're going to feel a lot worse if their wealth dropped in half, and they're not going to feel that much better if their wealth doubled. So there's marginal utility in a way that just at least can have some value without.
I'll interject a little commercial here that our Maxify Planner software does full expected utility maximization. Actually, it does like 500 trajectories of living standard when you're adjusting, and then it puts it all through a C to the a CARA utility, constant relative risk averse utility function, and then it does comparisons across different investment strategies. Okay, this one, given, and people have to indicate how risk averse versus risk tolerant versus risk loving they are, and then it's like a high, middle, a high, very high, medium, low, very low risk aversion tolerance and risk tolerance. And then you get to see an actual calculation as a kind of a certainty equivalent. This thing is going to, this strategy relative to the base strategy, this strategy makes me 10% better off in the sense of, if I were forced to have the base strategy investment portfolio, it would be, my happiness here would be equivalent to there, but being able to consume 10% more in every state that happens, in every outcome that occurs. That would be so I'm hoping that I can kind of break through this eyes glazed over. It's a long haul. You're absolutely right. But let's talk about this most recent paper, which is quite fascinating. It's called and you have lots of terrific papers, so people should really delve into your wadepfau.com, right, and delve into all the work. But here you have a paper called "The Dangers of Monte Carlo Simulations." So maybe you could start out by explaining kind of the traditional, because not everybody's into what the traditional Monte Carlo simulation is, and what that is, and then kind of bring us over to your paper that you wrote with Massimo Young. And it's a pretty strong title, "The Dangers," because everybody in the financial world basically is doing this same type of analysis. So whether you're talking about eMoney or Money Guy Pro, whatever tool that's being used, the Monte Carlo seems to be the same, which you're going to tell us about. Go ahead.
Yeah, and with the title of it, usually the editors pick the title, so it is probably a little more provocative than the point of the article. But absolutely, and just before getting into that too, with your software, at the Retirement Researcher, we have an online community of the more sophisticated, like do-it-yourself engineer retirees. We have a lot of people who love your software. And I got pretty familiar with your software back when it was the ES Planner days, but you've kind of got the new generation. I've looked at it a little bit, but haven't had the full chance to dive into everything that's changed from the ES Planner days. But
I'm going to send you after this. Also, I'm going to email you a coupon code to get a license for it.
Oh, great! Thank you.
Yeah.
So Monte Carlo simulations, it's used extensively in financial planning now, and it's kind of interesting. There was an article in 1997 in the Journal of Financial Planning that was just saying, advisors, you should start using Monte Carlo. And again, we'll talk about what it is, but it's going to probably work better than what people were doing, like I mentioned before, just plugging in average historical numbers, which would correspond to a 50% success rate in Monte Carlo. Monte Carlo is simply pulling random returns based on the characteristics you're describing. So the S&P 500, historically, if it's 7% compounded return, but usually with Monte Carlo, you look at the simple arithmetic numbers. So if you're saying like a 9 or 10% average return with a 20% historical volatility, and then the Monte Carlo is just going to generate a sequence of returns to, okay, well, let's pull numbers out of that distribution. Maybe we get a 13% return, then we get a negative 10% return, then a 5% return, and just do that multiple times so that you can do it 500 or 1,000 times or more. And then you can see, so when we say that the 4% rule worked in the historical data 100% of the time, if you develop a Monte Carlo simulation calibrated to the historical data, you're going to be able to get a lot more simulations out of it. And with the historical data calibration, usually you'd find that the 4% rule might work like 93% of the time. it's not always going to work just due to the randomization of those numbers. But the danger part comes in with how sensitive Monte Carlo is to the inputs.
And by the way, everybody, just in case you don't know where Monte Carlo, the name came from, it's from the town on the coast of France, on the Riviera, where you have a casino called Monte Carlo, the Monte Carlo Casino, and probably there was a James Bond movie that featured it. But anyway, so that's the idea. The randomness is coming from kind of like casino betting. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, right. And it sounds like gambling, but it's not necessarily anything inherently wrong with Monte Carlo. The point of this article with Massimo Young was more just pointing out how different the results can be based on the input assumptions. And what we did was we looked at a number of different financial services firms put out their estimates for future market, like their capital market assumptions. One company may be saying that the stock market's going to average 10% a year. Another company might say it's going to average 6% a year, and so on and so forth, and also with volatilities. And when you just take each company's assumptions and then test a retirement income spending strategy off of that, such as like the 4% rule is a simple one to just use as a test, the probability that the plan will work could vary quite a bit. It's quite sensitive. So with more optimistic input assumptions, maybe you get a 95% success rate for the spending plan. But if you use another set of capital market assumptions, it's a little bit more pessimistic. Maybe it's only going to come out as a 50% success rate. And that has important implications, because if there's a fundamental assumption, we need the plan to have at least an 80 or 90% success rate, the level of sustainable spending that you can have is going to vary quite a bit based on your inputs. And with those inputs varying so widely in practice, you really don't know what to do with with that. That was the point of the article. Was just
so if you're let's say your planner is running you with a more pessimistic set of assumptions, more volatility and less mean on stocks, for example, and I know you ran like a 50-50 stocks bonds analysis here. What it means is that you can't, if you want to hit a 80% probability of not losing your shirt, of not ending up with zero, then you have to maybe cut your spending from 4% of your initial assets every year to more like 2%. It could be dramatically different for the same, trying to achieve the same probability of great success, which is not a low failure. So a couple questions here. One is, it strikes me that the criteria of, to an economist, the idea of having any probability of really being out of money or really poor, let alone completely broke and living on the street, people would want to really avoid that, and that a 20% chance of ending up that way is not a really good plan, because it's just got too much risk. Even a 5% chance of being impoverished relative to where you were earlier in life. But then a separate question I have is about the focus on that particular statistic, as opposed to, you could take a portfolio that was, let's say, 100% bonds, and then start increasing the share that's in stock, and you raise the probability. As you increase the share, you raise the probability of success, you lower the probability of failure, but you do raise the probability of failing sooner in life, of running out of money sooner. So I'm wondering whether we need another Wade Feld article that focuses on the increased probability of being broke for longer, because
the magnitudes of shortfall.
Yeah, because you can't have more risk without more cost somewhere. It's got to, but it's not showing up in this statistic, because as you increase that share that's in stock, the only thing that happens is the probability goes up and the probability of failure goes down, probability of success goes up and failure goes down. But something else bad has to happen. Otherwise, everybody would be just in stocks, right?
Right.
100% stock. So, and that bad thing is going broke earlier. Less chance of going broke, but when you do, but the higher chance of going broke earlier, which means you've got more years where you're starving in effect, which is not good. But so I'm not sure these are questions as opposed to my commentary, but I did have a question, which is, how are these companies, you analyze like 20 different sets of assumptions about returns and variability, variances of let's say the stock market return. How are these companies coming up with the different assumptions about the market mean and variance? Are they looking at different, some company going back 20 years, some people going back 10 years looking at the data, some going back to 1926 when we first have data?
Mm-hmm.
Where's this all coming from, this variability of assumptions?
Yeah, so there's a few different, I think with these companies, it's mainly always forward looking, but just with the financial planning software out there, the more standard approach is you take the Morningstar stocks, bonds, bills, and inflation data set going back to 1926, and you calculate historical mean returns and volatilities and correlations for each of the asset classes, and you plug that into the software. And that's where the capital market assumptions are just based on the historical data. With the companies who are doing this, I think there's more of an element of trying to be forward-looking. And in that regard, there's different approaches they can use, but generally, it's really a matter of getting these building blocks. So what are the bond returns going to be? The best predictor of that is just the current interest rate environment. And then what kind of risk premium are you going to add to those numbers to get your stock returns? And then volatilities is always something that's really hard. I think I don't know how different companies are going to forecast volatility. I tend to just use historical volatility just because who knows over the next 30 years how volatile the stock market's going to be. But I suppose there could be an element of, if interest rates are lower and you're maybe believing that the risk premiums from the stock market might be lower than their historical numbers, you might also be willing to accept a lower volatility on that as well, because lower risk premium, maybe it is going to be less volatile. But at the end of the day, I think usually volatility numbers tend to be somewhat closer to historical, and you might see more of the discrepancy in the average return type numbers. So since playing around with risk premiums.
Since we think that returns on stocks and any financial asset are random walks, that they're really moving, there's some mean trend to the return, like the average return on stocks. Historically, it might be 9% real, whatever the latest values are. But so there's that trend. And obviously, if you don't take money out, put money in a pot, leave it in the stock market, it's earning on average 9%. Well, relative to taking some money out, including the same amount every year, you're going to end up with much more. But then and then obviously there's variability, which is like a 20% standard deviation around that, maybe 9%, 9.5% return. So one year it could be basically negative 10%. The other year it could be up 30%. That could be a typical kind of a stock market experience. So you have to have pretty good nerves to hold on. But there's no for sure guarantee that tomorrow, if today is low, tomorrow is going to be high, because if people knew it was going to be high, if there was any kind of guarantee, people would be buying today and given the knowledge of, or selling today, knowing what was going to be tomorrow. And that would mean that for sure thing would not happen, because the return is like kind of compared to today versus tomorrow. The capital gain would not be there. That would be forecast, because it would be undone. So the only reason that these characteristics of the return distribution can change through time is if the underlying economy is changing. So, the fact that returns have been higher for a while, and so that the mean seems to be higher than it was historically over, let's say, the last 10 years. So you could say, well, I think that's because of the economy. You'd have to say, I think that if you want to use the last 10 years, the last 20 years, I think the economy has changed fundamentally. We have things that we didn't have back in 1930. All kinds of technologies didn't exist, iPhones, whatever, internet. But of course, there were lots of inventions like, improvement of just the automobile that when I first got my first car, my parents' cars were always breaking down. We never have cars basically breaking down anymore. But it was like an every other day occurrence back then. Are these folks, they have to be thinking that the underlying economy has changed. Do they pronounce any kind of discussion or do they provide any discussion? I'm using the last 15 years because I think that's where the structural break in the economy's product. We have 35,000 different businesses in the country. Most are big, of course, but in terms of employment. But to have that kind of a confidence that how the economy has changed fundamentally compared to just saying, well, I'm going to just use all the data I can because I don't know enough about this. I mean, has anybody kind of in the aftermath of your publishing this article, has anybody kind of talked to you about why their assumptions are exactly the right ones? And is it bait? I mean, it could be the last 10 years were high just because of random outcomes, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what the random walk theory says. There's a lot of randomness, right? You could just have a series of high returns just by random draws.
This definitely comes up as an issue, and especially in the context of a lot of the research does look to use as much data as possible. So you've got Robert Shiller's data set that goes back to 1871, the Morningstar data that goes back to 1926. But of course, people will say, well, the economy is so different now than it was. I mean, there's no such, people are not investing in the financial markets for the most part up until recent history. So maybe that data is not all that useful. And of course, that could be entirely valid. You will see people sometimes using more recent data to feed into their simulations, but I don't think it's necessarily due to making a judgment call specifically that, such as you're saying, like, well, maybe the world economy changed in the early 1970s, so we should only look at post-1970 data or something more recent as well. I think it's more when you start adding in other asset classes, and eventually you're going to be constrained that, well, this asset class only has data going back to 2001. Therefore, we can only look at data since 2001. And I think that's how you usually end up with people who may be using more recent data only. It's not so much an argument that this is more reflective of what the economy should look like in the future. It's more reflective of the constraint that I wanted to add more asset classes into the data. And so this is as far back as the data goes.
Yeah, we circumvent that by having like 5 assets that are kind of core assets that have very long time series that are coterminous in a sense that they start and stop at the full period. And then we do kind of an arbitrage pricing. So we have somebody introduces a new asset with a shorter time series. We kind of basically run a regression of the return on that asset based on against the returns on the other 5 over the periods where they have synchronous data.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the way we're trying to get around it. And I did after I read your article, which I really find quite fascinating. I said, let's go back to our Monte Carlo simulations, which looks at so we're focused on the variability of people's living standard. So we looked at kind of the standard deviation and said, we're going back to using data series going back to 26, the Morningstar stock market return and other in other data on bonds and so forth that have long histories. So, and let's say, well, let's start with data let's try it once this way for the same kind of household, exactly your household that you use in your study. Let's use that series going back as far as, we start our starting date back in like 1920, 25. And then let's start with 1950 data. And then let's start with, from that point on, get the characteristics of returns from that point on, and from 1975 and from 2000. And let's compare the Monte Carlo outcomes of living standard. And I think because people in our software are adjusting their spending all the time, we're not getting we're getting, and I'm going to write an article shortly that talks about your article, but also compares it with the Monte Carlo simulations we're finding. We're not finding this kind of hypersensitivity. There is some sensitivity, but not.
Variable spending is important. Yeah. It's a great release valve or safety release for the sequence of returns risk. That another issue with the 4% rule is simply, as a simplification, it actually maximizes the sequence of returns risk because there is no release. You keep spending the same amount no matter how the portfolio is performing. And if you can simply cut your spending with market downturns, increase your spending if the market's doing well.
Let me ask you to define in your words sequence of return risk. So because not everybody who will be listening to this will, has kind of our experience and background and lingo. So I'm thinking about my good friend Jay, who's a nurse, and he's always asking me about. He watches the podcast, but then there are some questions. So for Jay, what would the hi Jay, what would be the story there about what sequence of return risk means?
Yeah. So the idea would be like we say, well, if retirement's going to last 30 years, the markets should do fine on average over 30 years. It may be down, maybe up, but overall it's going to be fine. I don't have to worry too much. But really that idea of an average market return, that only applies if I put money into the market today and leave it alone for 30 years. The order of the returns doesn't matter. I'm always going to have the same amount at the end of that 30-year period. But if I'm introducing cash flows over time, so there is sequence risk during the savings period. Like when I start my career, the market returns aren't going to have much impact because I haven't really saved much yet. But by the last year of my career, that market return is impacting all the years of my savings. And so it's the most important pre-retirement return. And then I retire, and the sequence risk really amplifies at that point. And it's not just the returns that you get over time, it's the order that the returns come. So if I get a market downturn at the start of retirement, because I'm spending from that portfolio, even if the overall market recovers, my portfolio is not going to recover fully. I'm more vulnerable to what happens early in retirement. And conversely, at the end of my retirement, it really doesn't matter what the market's doing at that point because my sustainable spending level would have already been defined. So the sequence of returns risk is I could have a great average return over retirement, but if I get a downturn early on and then markets recover later on, I'm going to be in trouble. And you see that.
Plus, especially if you've taken money out early on, let's say, you take out money and then you keep taking out money the same amount, independent of how well the market does poorly, but you're still taking out the same amount. And then the market does great, but all the money you've taken out is not there to get this higher return.
Right.
Because you didn't adjust downward as the market went down. So you actually maximize your sequence of return risk.
Right. And that's where if you're using a variable spending strategy, you get some relief because you actually start reducing your spending and there's more left for your portfolio to subsequently recover with. But you see this in historical data because that 4% rule was triggered by the 30 years from 1966 to 1995. And that was in the late 60s, early 70s, high inflation. The S&P 500 had several really down years as well, the 66, 69, 73, 74. Then after 1982, that's about halfway, a little more than halfway through that retirement 30-year period. Markets do really well after 1982. So the average returns to a portfolio over that 30-year period from 66 to 95 weren't that bad, but it's the sequence of returns, risk, and action. Your portfolio is so decimated by 1982 because you're spending from it, that even though the markets do really well after 1982, and 1982 is actually the best case scenario where you could have used almost a 10% withdrawal rate between 1982 and 2011. It's just at that point, it's too late for that 1966 retiree. Their realized spending potential was much less than what would have been implied by the average return the markets experienced during that 30-year retirement.
Right. So just when you run our software, when I send it to the new version, it has this Monte Carlo on people. It was called full risk investing, upside and downside risk to your living standard as you're investing aggressively and spending maybe aggressively or not. You'll see that those trajectories and where they distribute. But then we have another method of running Monte Carlo, which is called upside investing, which eliminates the sequence of return risk pretty much entirely. It works like this. You kind of spend, you put some money in the stock market, and then you add to it, and then you tell the program when you're going to add to it and how much, and then you say when you're going to start withdrawing and stop withdrawing. And then it says, okay, I'm now going to build a plan assuming all the money in the stock market that's there now and that's going to be added is lost 100%. And I'm going to invest everything else in tips. So I'm going to build a living standard floor. And then when I start withdrawing, whatever I have in the market, in that stock market bucket, and I've assumed all the way in the spending that it's gone for good. But when I start withdrawing, if there's something there, I immediately put it into tips. So that lets me raise my sustainable living standard, my living standard floor. So you just have a living standard floor that's flat. And then when you start withdrawing, there's different degrees of upside to your living standard. But over that holding period where you're not spending it all out of it, either explicitly by making withdrawals or implicitly by assuming it's going to be there, you have no sequence of return risk because you're saying it's like, I think about it as like going to Las Vegas, leaving your wallet back in the room, taking the $300 to the gambling tables, and assuming that you're going to leave Las Vegas, the casino, with nothing. And so you don't, in the middle of playing the tables, you don't go onto Amazon and start buying stuff, even if you're up, because you could go back down. So you just don't take any risk whatsoever. And then if you leave the casino, then you get to increase your spending because you put it into something safe once you leave. So that's where I got this idea. And also talking to this V. Bodie about his kind of safety first investing. And you've written about investing with that kind of a title as well, right? One of the books is about.
Yes, I think that's when I first was getting into retirement income planning, talked about this idea of there's these two schools of thought for retirement, and I called them probability based and safety first. And yeah, it's the same terms V. Bodie uses as well. And today, and I think in terms of like what you're describing as well, so the more recent work I've been doing is on this idea of retirement income styles. Okay. And like, who does the 4% rule resonate? Who does your upside investing approach resonate with? We found that there's these two primary factors that help to explain preferences. And one of the factors we call probability-based versus safety-first. Probability-based is I'm comfortable relying on the risk premium from a diversified portfolio to fund a higher level of spending in retirement than bonds. Of course, there's risk with that, but some people are comfortable minimizing that risk. Safety first is, no, when it comes to my core spending, I want to have contractual protections behind that, whether it's holding individual bonds or being able to get a higher spending level through risk pooling with insurance and annuities. Risk pooling and risk premium are two competitive ways to potentially spend more than bonds alone. And then we have the other factor is this idea of optionality versus commitment. Do I want full flexibility for my assets, or do I actually prefer to commit to something that will solve for a lifetime need? And then with these two factors, it really explains the different investing styles. So someone who is more comfortable with just an investment approach, taking their risk with the market, we call that total returns. That's probability based. They're comfortable relying on the markets for growth, and they want to maintain full optionality for their assets. Someone who's safety first, wanting contractual protections and commitment oriented, that's more of the income protection approach, where they want to have their basics covered with an income floor. And then once that is done,
like tips, and you're kind of indemnifying that liability. You're kind of saying, I gotta pay for that. I have to have this much money. I'm going to make sure that's safe. And then, but it doesn't have to be all or nothing. With the upside investing, because you do have, it's amazing that because the stock market is such a good casino, it's not Caesar's Palace in any way, shape, or form, because the average return is very high. On average, you do walk out of the casino with money. That you don't have to put that much in, like 20% of your assets, if you're in your 40s or 30 or even 50s, you can get a very high upside. Obviously, it's not guaranteed, but the probability, the median 50% percentile of the highest realized lifetime spending from this strategy, incorporating your post-withdrawal spending level, it's pretty high. So I found that I was amazed at the fact that you can still have some money in the market and still, really hope and expect to have a really comfortable retirement from the market, helping you out without taking any fundamental risk to your living, to your basics. And that can let you sleep at night, but still give you, I think people are worried about losing on the market and waking up in the morning and having to shoot themselves, but they're also worried about missing out. And so this is trying to solve both of those. But let me, we're kind of come up to the hour, but let's talk about anything else you want to kind of leave the listener, the viewer with in terms of advice about, I get that, and I think you have gone across the message that there are different risk attitudes, there's different approaches, different styles of investing, and you have to figure out whether you're kind of A or B, what type you are, how much living standard risk you want to take or willing to absorb. And then that's going to, from that you're going to decide your strategy. So that's very important. But anything else that you want to kind of major message you want to leave people with, apart from reading your 4 books?
Well, nothing major, but just I've become agnostic about the retirement strategies that people use. I certainly think mathematically a very strong case can be made for that income protection. And that's the academic approach. It's first you build that floor of protected income, and then you can go ahead and invest for more discretionary types of goals. That's what the utility maximization is going to point you towards. But I just see so much pushback against that, with people thinking it's too costly to build the floor. It's too costly to have all that money in tips. And they think they're just missing out on too much yield. And they're comfortable with the idea that the stock market's definitely going to provide the outperformance that historically has happened, but we don't know if it's going to happen in the future. But yeah, so some people, it's just, that's not going to resonate. And so I'm okay with, well, if it's your style to have more of that total return investing approach, that's fine. It's a viable approach, but certainly the math is more in favor of a flooring approach. And this assessment tool that we created with the retirement income style awareness, I think can really help people identify. I think the typical consumer doesn't even know they have options about how do they build the retirement strategy. And at least this can help point them in the direction of an option that they are going to feel more comfortable with. And so they'll stick with it. It's important to stick with the plan that you choose. And so getting the right plan at the beginning is important.
So I think both your tool, I mean, we have these tools about Monte Carlo, and I think people that, have one attitude versus the other. It's not all or the other. It's not all or nothing. You can have both really good upside with not necessarily that much risk to your downside, or even no risk to your downside. And so you're developing a tool that's trying to show people the picture of what could happen. And we are too. And that I think is kind of a innovation that we economists are providing here, because we're showing people, I think, what they need to see, which is the range of outcomes if they invest this way or that way, they spend this way or that way, aggressively or not. And that's very different from just focusing on putting things on autopilot with my spending and thinking that an 80% probability is high enough and I don't have to worry about, because the other 20% will never happen because 80% is too high, such a high number. But unfortunately, it does happen. And on the way, and it might not even really, but you might panic on the way. You might pull.
Right.
In some sense, it may not happen to you, but you might make it happen to you because you panic, and because of sequence of return risk, you pull it all out. The next day it goes back up, and of course, it could go down further. So you don't know. I mean, you're sitting there in 2008, and 11 months later, it's down 53%, and you keep, and it's dropping. When Lehman fell apart, it was dropping 500 points a day, the stock market. And can you really handle that psychologically? That's
the tragedy too, that if a lot of people who end up with more of a total return approach because they didn't know there were alternatives, they weren't really comfortable with it, and then they abandon it after a big market downturn. And you're right, that is effective. The idea that the 4% rule worked historically also relies on the heroic assumption that people rebalance on cue every year to an aggressive asset allocation. They never panic. They never deviate away from that. And with the reality that they might abandon the strategy at the worst possible time, being something that people do, that would, of course, increase the failure rate of the plan in a manner not accounted for in the basic research.
Yeah. Well, listen, it's been fabulous catching up again. Hope we'll be in closer touch and keep doing your terrific work. I will send you our software, and I'd like to see yours as well. It'd be fun to compare. But keep it up, and I think you're making a huge contribution to the real world.
Well, thank you.
Not just Ivy Tower. Ivy Tower. All right.